So now we're going to focus on one particular phylum called Chordata. And the chordates are animals, right? They are bilaterian animals, meaning we have bilateral symmetry, which we share with most other animals. And we belong to the clade of animals called Deuterostomia, along with echinoderms. And that means we have deuterostome development, which means the blastopore, that first hole that develops as you're undergoing gastrulation, becomes the anus instead of the mouth. You develop another hole later that becomes the mouth. And there are three main groups of chordates. We're used to the vertebrates, right? Because we are vertebrates. But there are two invertebrate groups of chordates, the urochordates and the cephalochordates. And here's a look at the deuterostome clade, right? So here's our deuterostome common ancestor, right? And we branched off, and some deuterostomes became echinoderms, and some became chordates. And this basal group of chordates is cephalochordata, which we'll look at in a moment, and they're sort of your classic example of a chordate. The main characteristics of chordates are all displayed very clearly in cephalochordata. The next group to branch off is urochordata. Right? This is another class within the phylum Chordata. And then we get heads, right? And then this starts to become what we think of as vertebrate animals. Now, the first organism with a head or craniate is Myxine, the hagfish, and they don't actually have a true vertebral column, but very soon after they evolve, the vertebral column evolves, and we get some actual technical vertebrates, right? And these guys are still alive today, some of them, and you can find them all over the Great Lakes, etc., etc. And then we get jaws, and we get sharks, for instance, cartilaginous skeletoned fish, and then we get bony skeletoned fish, ray-finned and lobe-finned, and then from lobe-finned fish, we get fish that have limbs with digits, right, that kind of crawl out of the water, and lugs eventually. And then we start with our amphibians. Then we'll talk about the amniotic egg and the many mammalian adaptations, for instance, milk and fur, that make mammals mammals. And we'll get into a bit of human evolution toward the end of this chapter. But I want to start by talking about the four key characteristics of chordates. And all chordates have these four characteristics at least some point in their development or life cycle. And they are notochord, which is like a relatively hard chord, a little bit flexible, that is sort of like a skeleton. It's kind of the precursor to our skeleton. A dorsal hollow nerve cord. So this is what became our spinal cord and brain. And note that it's dorsal. Right? Most of the animals that we've looked at so far have had ventral nerve cords, if they've had a nerve cord at all. Right? Jellyfish, for instance, have no nerve cord, just a distributed nerve net. Pharyngeal slits or clefts. So the pharynx is the throat, so some slits or holes in the pharynx, which a lot of organisms use for gills, for instance. So you might think of these as gills, although other organisms use them for filter feeding. And then muscular post-anal tail, which is exactly what it sounds like. So muscular tail behind the anus. And here you can see all of these structures. Right here's that notochord right here, which is providing structure. You've got that dorsal hollow nerve cord, right, which is sort of the central nervous system here. You have pharyngeal slits or clefts, which are sometimes gill slits, but in this case, they're filter feeding clefts that filter out junk from the water, send it into the digestive tract, right? Pharynx is the throat, behind that is the digestive tract, and a post-anal muscular tail, and often muscular segments. So chordates are segmented in some ways, kind of like annelids and arthropods, although the segments do look a little bit different, right? This is sort of the precursor to, like, you think of how our abdominal muscles are segmented, in that six-pack that I definitely possess, right? No doubt about it, definitely do. Anyway, that's these muscle segments are what developed into that in later organisms like humans. So the notochord, this flexible rod, provides essentially skeletal support. It provides structure and also something for muscles to pull on, right? So you can swim, right? And in most vertebrates, it becomes more complex. And in addition to that, which sort of develops into your vertebrae, you get a jointed skeleton that develops like you're going to see around Halloween here. That most of the animals that we think about have. The nerve cord is dorsal, meaning on the back side rather than ventral on the front side, and it develops into the brain and the spinal cord in most chordates. Not all have really a brain, but most do. And the gill slits, as I said, probably originally evolved as suspension feeding structures, right? So filtering water through through your pharynx and pushing the water out through the slits, but keeping the food junk that was in the water in your pharynx. But they function in gas exchange for a lot of vertebrates. So gills, for instance, are gas exchange structures. But tetrapods, which include us, do not use these for gas exchange, right? They end up developing into parts of the ear, head, and neck, and we'll go through those details later. And the first main group of chordates is Cephalochordata, again, the oldest main group. And the sort of classic example of Cephalochordata are the lancelets. They're called that because they look like a lance or a sword. And they are marine suspension feeders, and they, as adults, have all of the main chordate characteristics. Reminder that in the phylogeny of chordates, all these are chordates, we are up here with Cephalochordata. This is the first group to branch off, the most unrelated to the rest of the chordates. They are to chordates what Porifera is to animals, right? They're the basal group. And this is what they look like. This is a picture. This is a little bit easier to see. You can see some of these structures here, the pharyngeal gill slits here. Again, we take water in through here, push the water out of the gill slits, but the food stays in here, goes to the digestive tract. So pharyngeal gill slits. We also have, again, our notochord, and dorsal to that is the dorsal nerve cord. We have our anus, and behind that we have a muscular tail. So this is a muscular post-anal tail here. And again, all chordates have these basic structures. I want you to be pretty familiar with those structures on a cephalochordate. So Cephalochordata is our first subphylum of chordates. Urochordata is our second subphylum of chordates. These are the two invertebrate subphyla, or completely invertebrate subphyla, I should say. And this includes tunicates, which are actually more related to the rest of chordates than they are to lancelets, to cephalochordates. But they only show those four main structures all when they are a larva. And they're called sea squirts because when they're attacked, they squeeze and shoot water out of their excurrent siphon. Reminder that we were at Cephalochordata, now we're at Urochordata, right? So this is an image of an actual sea squirt, urochordate, and here's a picture, or an animation, I should say, a drawing. And you can see these are adults. Water comes in through the incurrent siphon, goes through the pharynx or the throat, and the pharynx has slits in it, right? One of those chordate structures. And then water comes out here and leaves through the excurrent siphon. And food gets stuck in here and comes in through the intestines and the stomach and out the anus. That goes out with this water through the excurrent siphon. Pretty cool. And again, you can see all these main parts here. The pharynx looks like a basket in the middle. But that's only one of those four things. We have no notochord, we have no dorsal hollow nerve cord, and we have no post-anal muscular tail. So where are those things? And how in the world does this seem like it's more related to us than it is, a jellyfish or a mollusk or something like this? Well, if you look at its larva looks much more like a cephalochordate. It's got a dorsal hollow nerve cord, it's got a notochord, and this muscular tail that is post-anal. And it still has this pharynx with gill slits. Now, it doesn't live very long as a larva. It will, once sperm and egg come together, they form this larva pretty quickly, and then it swims through the water and plants itself in the ground, and then you have this for the rest of its life, but its origins display its chordate heritage. And at this point, we still have fewer Hox genes than other vertebrates. So Hox genes, as we mentioned before, are one of those genes that are important for regulating development, especially body plan, right? Dictating limbs, how many you have, where they go, when they develop. And vertebrates tend to have a lot more Hox genes than most other animals, but not tunicates, and also not cephalochordates. So there were some Hox genes that were there the whole time, and other Hox genes that are only shared by specifically vertebrates, which are the group of chordates that have, a vertebral column and usually a bony skeleton otherwise too. So genome sequencing has suggested that the genes that are associated with the heart and the thyroid, for instance, are common to all chordates. But the genes associated with the transmission of nerve impulses are unique specifically to vertebrate. And here you can see what these same Hox genes are doing in a lancelet embryo versus in the embryo of another chordate, sort of a typical chordate. Here we're developing a brain, which you don't do in a lancelet. So aside from cephalochordates and urochordates, right, most chordates have a head, right? They have a skull that protects a brain, and that has eyes and other sensory organs up front, right? Cephalization, which has evolved in other animals, of course. Even platyhelminths, flatworms, have cephalization, and it's lost a couple times in evolution. For instance, echinoderms don't really have it, but this idea of a skull enclosing a brain, this is something that craniates have. So if you are a chordate that has a head, a skull protecting a brain, you are a craniate. Psst, we're craniates. And craniates have another cluster of Hox genes, right, as opposed to lancelets and tunicates, which only have one cluster, and this seems to lead to a neural crest, which leads to a brain. And the original craniates were aquatic craniates, and these pharyngeal clefts that were specifically for filter feeding evolved into gill slits, so they're there for gas exchange. Craniates tend to have a higher metabolism, they're more muscular, they have a heart with at least 2 chambers, hemoglobin, kidneys, so they're just more complex creatures. And it seems like even all the way back to the Cambrian explosion, we were starting to see very tiny craniates. Right? Haikouella, for instance, is a 3 centimeter long craniate so it's not a vertebrate specifically. It doesn't have a true vertebral column, but it has a brain, eyes, muscular segments, not quite a skull. So here you can see actual fossils of Haikouella, and this is kind of a drawing to show you what it would have looked like. So we've got a head here, no skull, but a brain. And a little bit later on in the Cambrian period, Myloncomungia even had a skull. So this is a true craniate. So the point being, I don't need to remember the names of those 2 organisms, but all the way back even to the Cambrian period, there clearly are true craniates with heads and skulls. But I do want you to know today's living group of craniates that is the most basal, and it's Myxinae, or the hagfishes. And these have a cartilaginous skull, an axial rod of cartilage that's derived from the notochord, but it's not a true vertebral column. They do have a small brain, eyes, and ears. They're marine, and they give off this crazy goo, mucus, to protect themselves from predators. As a reminder, here's where we are in our phylogeny, right? We're craniates now, and this is what they look like. So you can see these slime glands around here that make that mucus to protect them, and this is what that head looks like. Not much of a head, but there you have it. All right, in the next video, we're going to start to talk about true vertebrates that have a vertebral column.